intelligence is no guard against any of this. It's all about the incentives. So what do people want to believe? And intelligent people will be more likely to be able to convince themselves of things that they actually want to believe rather than things that are actually true.
There's that famous Orwell quote, it's like an idea so stupid only an academic could believe it, or something like that.
Yeah, it's a great quote, yeah. The purpose of academia is not actually to tell the truth. It's to get a high H index. It's to have your academic papers published in the New York Times. I've noticed with my own self is that the longer I spend on social media, the more deluded I become. And the more culture warrior I become. I used to spend a lot of time on Twitter, or X as it's now called. And the more time I spent on it, the more I'd get angry at the things I saw, and the more I'd become tribal, and the more I'd lash out at people. And, I just didn't like the person that I became when I was on social media.
Because I always felt that in the last 10 years, what we really need to worry about is anxiety is contagious. And people who are anxious tend to sell their anxiety to everybody else, because either I'm a fool for being anxious or you're a fool for not being anxious. So they're invested in selling their anxiety to other people, because otherwise they're overwrought and hysterical.
Well, on social media, they think the world's falling apart, and they think there's going to be this civil war, and everybody's going to be killing each other in the streets.
So hello there, Gurwinder Bhogal. I'm delighted you've joined us on our podcast. Would you help us out by introducing yourself and telling everybody about you and your work?
Yeah, so hi guys. So I'm Gurwinder. So I'm originally a tech guy. So I did a bit of work for Microsoft. And one of the things I was doing was behavioral analysis. So I was sort of looking at the ways people use the internet, looking at what they click on, what searches they make, and all that kind of stuff to try to work out their behavior. And as I was working in the tech industry, and I kind of became more interested in looking at the sort of bugs in human psychology than the bugs in the actual technology itself. So I became more interested in psychology, and I sort of left the tech industry and began to write about the ways in which the digital age is kind of affecting human brains and human behavior. So that kind of put me on the path to being a writer. And since then, I've been sort of covering the ways that people are fooled by sort of algorithms and things like that. And just more generally, online trends, how these affect people, and internet culture, and how that's sort of affecting human behavior. So, that's basically what I do.
Where are you now? Is it mostly on Substack and kind of social media that people would find you?
Yeah. So I have a Substack, which is just Gurwinder.blog, where I kind of just cover how internet culture is affecting human behavior. And I'm also on Twitter, although less so recently because of recent developments. But just generally, mainly on sort of Gurwinder.blog, the Substack, and just write about that.
And let me say at this point that it is my absolute favorite Substack of all. I've been reading it for years. I've learned so much.
Thank you.
I'm a big fan. I'm your number one fan. I want to start with one of my favorite of your articles, if you don't mind. It's what's it called? Why smart people believe stupid things, or something like that. Because when I read that, so much fell into place when I was very early in the turf wars, and I was coming across seemingly very intelligent people believing that humans could change sex because something to do with clownfish and slugs. And your article explained everything. Could you talk us through it?
Yeah. So the premise of the article is essentially that smart people are capable of deluding themselves in ways that not so smart people are not. So intelligence is no guard against delusion. It can actually be a sort of contributor to delusion if it's directed in the wrong way. I think Saul Bellow said that a great deal of ignorance can be invested in intellect if the need for illusion is deep. And I've seen this quite a bit. I think I should probably start with how I sort of came to be interested in this. So I was originally on the left. I was originally sort of like left wing when I was young. And I began to sort of read a lot of left wing literature. And one of the things I noticed was the ways in which what is regarded as true and false changed depending on what the left wanted. So, for example, I think around 2011, it was pretty much forbidden to mention that there are differences on average between male and female brains. It was, if you basically pointed this out, you were basically a misogynist, you were a bigot. And I thought this was a bit strange because all of the literature up until that point had basically, there were robust findings that there were average differences. And I'm talking about average differences. I'm not saying all men and all women, are different in that respect, but on average. And the fact that it was sort of forbidden to say this, I thought was a bit strange. But then sort of when the sort of trans stuff became more prominent than the feminist stuff, this was around sort of 2015, I think. Suddenly it became acceptable to talk about the differences between male and female brains because this was now used to justify what we might call gender ideology. So what I realized was that intelligent people were rationalizing what was, the sort of research. Initially, they said, all of this is pseudoscience. There are no differences between men and female brains. And then suddenly, effortlessly, they just pivoted into, yes, there are average differences. And it was like, we've always been at war with East Asia kind of thing. Yeah. And so I became interested in the way that intellectuals could just fool themselves effortlessly to believe what they wanted to believe, and that they would use reason to do it, or at least the illusion of reason to do it. So they would rationalize these things. And then, I began, like Mia mentioned, the whole thing about clownfishes. And, there was all this other stuff as well. Like how, there is no single thing that differentiates all men from all women, So therefore, there is gender as a spectrum and sex as a spectrum, rather. And so this was the thing that kind of got me interested in this thing. And I realized that, hang on a second, it's intelligent people that are doing this, not the sort of lower rung of the IQ sort of bracket doing this. And so I began to do a bit of research into this, and I sort of found this whole literature about this. There's a guy called Dan Kahan, or Kahan, I don't know how you pronounce his surname, but he's a researcher, American researcher, I think, and he has done a lot of research into what he calls identity protective cognition, which is, his theory is basically that reason did not evolve for us to be right. It evolved for us to convince other people that we're right. So it's like a social thing, basically, reason and rhetoric and all of this stuff, all of these clever arguments. They're not actually tools to help us understand the truth. They're tools to help us convince others that we understand the truth. So, because if you look at it from
sales tactics.
Yeah. So if you look at it, it is sales tactics, because if you look at it from a survival point of view, if we could convince other people that we're right, that would have conferred more survival benefit than simply being right about something. So if you are in a tribe and you're living as a hunter-gatherer, on the savannas of Africa or something, and you want to convince people that you have special powers because, you want to be the lead elder, you want to be the tribal elder or whatever. It doesn't actually, it doesn't matter if you actually have magical powers. That doesn't actually matter. What matters is, can you convince the people that you do? Because that's going to get you the status. It's going to get you the women. It's going to allow you to have an evolutionary advantage. So in our evolutionary history, convincing others that we're right is more important than actually being right a lot of the time. And so we developed this capacity for rationalization. And this is why highly intelligent people who have this skill of rationalization, they're able to engage in mental gymnastics to convince others and also to convince themselves, because even convincing yourself has evolutionary survival benefits. If you can convince, another example of this would be, if you look at two tribes, one of these tribes believes that the other tribe is a spawn of Satan and that they should be eradicated from the earth. And the other tribe is more reasonable and thinks, they're human beings just like us, right? Which tribe is going to win? It's the tribe that believes that the other side is a spawn of Satan, right? So if you could convince yourself of myths, you can also have an evolutionary benefit over those who believe the truth. So there is this advantage, this sort of selection effect, where people who are able to convince themselves and others of falsehood have been able to pass on their genes much more rapidly than those who were just interested in truth. And this is being passed down into our genes. And so we have this capacity for delusion, not just delusion of other people, but delusion for ourselves as well. And we see this all the time in academia, where if you look at academia, the purpose of academia is not actually to tell the truth. It's to get a high H index. It's to have your academic papers published in the New York Times. It's why we have a replication crisis. And for your audience, a replication crisis is an ongoing crisis in the academic humanities and also in social sciences and stuff, whereby most research papers can't be replicated. Like if people try to use the same methods that are listed in the papers, they don't get the same results, which shows that there's a lot of fraud going on. A lot of p-hacking, which is a method of statistical sort of manipulation, and a lot of this kind of stuff. You see that what people are doing in academia is, they're not really trying to tell. I mean, this is probably a generalization. Some people are trying to tell the truth in academia, but generally speaking, the people who get the highest H indexes, get the most clout in academia, are actually the people that will fake their results to show things that are, fashionable. So you see a lot of people, showing that there's more racism than there actually is, because if you do that, then you'll get into the New York Times. If you tell the truth and you say, well, actually, there's some evidence of racism, but it doesn't really, it's not significant, you're not going to get to the New York Times. If you say, oh, there's evidence that all white people are racist and, they are, holding black people down or whatever, if you say something dramatic like that, then you're going to get published in the New York Times. It's the same with the trans stuff. If you say stuff like, oh, kids that are denied puberty blockers will kill themselves. If you say something like that, you're going to get into the New York Times. If you say, well, there is a heightened rate of suicide, but we don't know the exact cause for it. There are many, many different variables at play here. You're not going to get into the New York Times. So, there are incentive structures which are bringing out this evolutionary bad habit that we have of deceiving others and deceiving ourselves, which really is, it makes the whole system, not just academia, but also the media. It makes this a corrupt system for trying to get to the truth. And it's, I think, one reason why we've seen the rise of ideologies like wokeism, because of the incentive structures. You're not incentivized for telling the truth. You're incentivized for pushing essentially oppression narratives. Oppression narratives are very, very powerful in the digital age. And I had first-hand experience of this because I saw this when I was working in tech, where, things that would sort of pit one group of people against another would get a lot more traction. Because what would happen is that the two tribes would essentially, they would repost the content because they would want to defend their side. So I have this sort of theory. I mean, Scott Alexander, he's a therapist, psychotherapist, I think, and also a great blogger. He has this idea called the Toxoplasma of rage, where he says that the ideas that spread furthest are not the ideas that everybody agrees with, but the ideas that divide people the most. Because what happens is that it creates a debate, and the two sides of the debate come together and they share the work in order to sort of defend their side. And so it creates this really robust debate, and the debate is what spreads the sort of narrative. And so this sort of harks back to, again, our tribal mentality, where we're looking at who's oppressing who. We have a tendency to view ourselves, our own tribe, as being oppressed. And so when you look at the internet and you look at the information space, you look at what narratives are getting propagated and which ones are being stifled, you see that the ones that are getting propagated the most are the ones that tend to be about oppression, one group oppressing another. So you see, for example, wokeism is, straight people are oppressing LGBT people, white people are oppressing black people, infidels are oppressing Muslims, whatever, and then you see on the other side, you see the Trumpian narrative, which is, that white men are being oppressed by, this kind of, woke academics or elitists or whatever. And, every sort of group has got its own oppression narrative, because these are the narratives that go viral in the digital age. So that was I was rambling for quite a long time there. I'm sorry, but yeah, but that kind of is generally sort of, why I was interested in this idea of why smart people believe stupid things, because intelligence is no guard against any of this. It's all about the incentives. So what do people want to believe? And intelligent people will be more likely to be able to convince themselves of things that they actually want to believe rather than things that are actually true.
It makes me think of that. I probably will get it wrong now, but there's that famous Orwell quote. It's like, an idea so stupid only an academic could believe it, or something like that.
Yeah. It's a great quote. Yeah.
And that's queer theory, and that's gender identity ideology to me. That's everything in my world. The ideas, the foundational ideas, are all just so blatantly idiotic that only smart people could believe them. And you see that they're surgeons, they've been to med school, they've done years and years in studying, and then they're doing this to children. And your article really helped me understand how that could be possible. I want to bring up mismatch theory. It's in my notes, which is tied very closely to what you were just talking about. I've seen you write that we evolved to be tribal, which worked really well when we were in a hunter-gatherer type society, but now in the digital world, the quote is, it causes us to act like polarized goons online. That
You're very quotable, Gurwinder.
He's so
Thanks.
Quotable.
Thanks. Yeah, I think a lot of our problems really do come down to the fact that we've created for ourselves a world we didn't evolve for. Because, since the Industrial Revolution, the world has just changed so rapidly that our sort of genes haven't been able to catch up with it. And tribalism is one of the big sort of evolutionary mismatches, because we did for 200,000 or 300,000 years, we were living as hunter-gatherers, and so we were living in these tight-knit communities, these tribal communities, and our sort of whole psychology is built around that. And then suddenly we find ourselves in this new world where we're a global village, where, we're having a conversation. You and I are having a conversation from the other side of the world. And, you're sort of exposed to news stories from all across the globe. You're exposed to the whole world's problems. And all of this sort of just creates these kind of, these delusions essentially in our brains, where we're just not used to the kind of world that we're in, and there's information overload. And I think another thing is that because we evolved for a low information world, we developed certain heuristics in order to survive in a low information world. Emotions are as one of these. Another one is apophenia. So apophenia is a psychological concept whereby people will see patterns in meaningless noise. An example of apophenia is pareidolia. So pareidolia is when you look at a cloud and you see a face, or when you see Jesus in a slice of toast or in spaghetti or something, So this is because, this is something that we evolved. We evolved like a kind of hypersensitivity to patterns, because if you go back, let's go back 300,000 years, and let's say you're on the plains of Africa, and your survival depends on whether you can detect a lion in the undergrowth. If you see a faint outline of a lion and you think, it's probably nothing, you're dead, right? You're going to die. You're going to get eaten. On the other hand, if you see a faint outline that could be a lion and you panic and you think, oh my God, that's a lion, even if that's not a lion, you're still going to live. So there's a mismatch here. So there's basically a sort of a skew towards being more panicking, being more paranoid. Because if you're paranoid, you'll survive. If you're oblivious, you won't.
Well,
So the paranoid were the people that passed on their genes. And they are, again, our genes are the paranoid genes because we inherited them from the people who survived. And so what this means is that we now have this hypersensitivity to patterns. When we see a pattern, we immediately think, oh my God, that's something, it's our boogeyman, when we look at a cloud, we see faces. And what this means is that when you look at a world that we're now in, which is a high information world, we can easily be led astray. The way I look at it is this, right? So being hypersensitive, being paranoid helps you in a low information environment. In a high information environment, it makes you deluded, because my metaphor is to look at the stars, right? So the night sky, you have a whole array of stars, right? And constellations actually have no astronomical validity. Just because the ancient Greeks drew lines between certain stars, it doesn't mean that those stars are connected in any way. They're not closer in space. They're not grouped categorically, in terms of what kind of star they are. There's literally no relation between these stars. The lines that the ancient Greeks drew between them were purely arbitrary, and they were based on their myths, right? So you have the myth of Perseus slaying Medusa. You have Leo and all of these sort of different constellations. They're all based on Greek mythology. And what's interesting is, if you look at the information space today, we have an infinite number of stars. We have so many data points because we have an information overload. So you can find any narrative that you want, and you can draw a constellation between these stories to tell any story you want. So that's essentially the world we're in. You can basically create any narrative you want. And if you have this hypersensitivity to patterns, you can see any pattern you want in all of this data. And if you're smart, you can do that even more skillfully. So what you see is people, for example, if we look at the woke, what they do is they look at data. Yeah. A lot of these people are academics. They look at data. They cherry pick the data that fits their oppression narrative. They ignore all the data that doesn't. And then they use this to justify their beliefs. And you see this in the way that certain academic papers go viral and others don't. If you look at the New York Times, what academic papers they report on, it's almost always something to do with bigotry, racism, oppression of some kind of the poor. It's oppression narratives. And if you are a smart person and you're reading the New York Times every day, you'll probably see all these. You won't see all of the papers that are not about oppression or which disprove oppression. You're only going to see the ones that prove oppression. So over time, this cherry-picked sort of system of information is going to skew your narrative towards believing that there is more oppression than there actually is. And this is really the problem that we're faced with, is especially if you're smart, because you're going to be in these circles where people are doing this. You're going to be exposed to this really limited information, really good information, but really limited information a lot of time. Mm-hmm. And so really, again, so to go back to Mia's original point, this is why tribalism, and not just tribalism, but the mismatch theory is a big problem, because we evolve for a low information environment, and our information gathering processes are configured for a low information environment. But because in the past few decades, we found ourselves in a high information environment, what that means is that our low information capacity has sort of become overloaded. And we're now looking and finding patterns everywhere where those patterns don't exist.
And have you any kind of what we should do about that fact, if you follow me? Because I totally agree with you. We are overloaded, and it's like we all walk around kind of shaking our heads saying information overload, we're doing too much. We know it. We all know it. There's very few people who don't say we're on our devices too much. Kids are on their devices too much. But we seem to be paralyzed from actually doing anything to kind of actually productively move beyond this awful environment.
Yeah, I mean, I try to be a bit more optimistic now. I mean, I think, it is pretty easy to be pessimistic in this kind of environment. But I look at things like the fact that we're quite young in terms of we haven't been in this new environment for very long, right? So we're still adjusting to it. And I think one thing that humans are very good at is adapting. We've been able to do it throughout our entire history, adapting to changing environments. And I think that it's going to take time for humans to adapt, but there are things that people can do. And I think you raise a good point, Stella, that we need to spend less time on our devices. because that is the source of our delusions. It's a source of information, but it's also a source of a lot of misinformation, and it's a source of cherry-picked information, which is just as bad as misinformation. So I think, like, one of the interesting things is that I've noticed with my own self is that the longer I spend on social media, the more deluded I become, and the more culture warrior I become. You know, I used to spend a lot of time on Twitter, or X as it's now called. And the more time I spent on it, the more I'd get angry at the things I saw, and the more I'd become tribal, and the more I'd lash out at people. And, you know, I just didn't like the person that I became when I was on social media. And so I began to sort of withdraw slightly and just try to not spend so much time on it. You know, some days, like back in the day, like 2018, when the culture war was at its height, I'd spend all afternoon on the computer, on Twitter or whatever, just typing away, having arguments with people about wokeism or whatever, you know. And I'd get so angry, and I'd get so angry, and I'd think that the world was going to fall apart. And there's this phenomenon that I call Dramageddon, which is this view that people get when they spend on social media. When on social media, they think the world's falling apart, and they think there's going to be the civil war, and you know, everybody's going to be killing each other in the streets. But then you actually leave your computer and you step outside and you go to the barbers or whatever, and, you know, and you just have a friendly chat with the barber, and you just think, well, you know, nobody's actually, all of this is an illusion. You know, it's not, there is no culture war in the sort of outside world. Okay. Yeah, there probably is in some institutions and things like that. But generally speaking, you know, people outside are quite friendly. They don't care too much about what you believe, you know, your political beliefs, all that sort of stuff. They just want to earn a living and just go home and, you know, and just enjoy life or whatever. And, you know, this sort of difference between these two worlds of this kind of online, you know, Armageddon or Dramageddon, and then just going outside and seeing peace and, you know, tranquility, just kind of made me think, you know, I need to spend a lot less time, you know, if not online, then at least arguing online, because that does just delude people into thinking problems are a lot bigger than they are. And this is not to say that problems are not, you know, serious. Obviously, you know, the whole stuff with gender is a serious issue, because it's led to real harm in the world. So I'm not saying that this is not an issue, but I think that what it does is it overloads the brain. It makes people feel like there's an imminent threat to them, which makes them irrational, and it makes them act in ways that they ordinarily wouldn't. It makes debate impossible, because people are, you know, in threat mode. They're in fight or flight mode, and when you're in fight or flight mode, you can't think clearly. You know, you're not able to really digest other people's points of view, and it can lead to a breakdown of conversation, a breakdown of any kind of common ground, which makes the problem even worse. You know, when two groups can't see eye to eye, then the debate becomes even more worthless. And so I do believe we should be having debates about things like gender and race, absolutely, but to do it in a more productive way. And doing it on social media just is not a good way of doing it, I don't think. I found that Substack is a great way of doing it, because Substack is long form. It's a long form.
Yeah.
I've noticed that the debates that happen on Substack are just so much more high quality than the debates that happen on Twitter.
Yeah.
Because
I need to get on Substack.
Different,
yeah,
it's a different space. It's like you're a dive bar that you drink too much and you fight with everybody, and then you move beyond into a nice place with nice food and drink. It's a completely, it's a beautiful space in comparison to Twitter. It
absolutely.
really is.
May I just speak in defense of Twitter for a moment, though, because
No.
because I learned almost in the beginning. I discovered the debate on Twitter, and I learned almost everything in the beginning from Twitter, from people on Twitter, from the TERFs, from gender critical people posting really thoughtful tweets. There was a lot of rage farming, and there was a lot of ugliness, but there was also a lot of incredible information and very, very intelligent people that taught me an awful lot. And then I will say that we've talked about this in our first episode. Everything that I have, every crazy turn that my life has taken, has also been the result of a Twitter thread. So there's good there if you know how to use it properly.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I wouldn't have met you if it went for Twitter, actually. I don't think so. You know, it does have its upsides, absolutely.
It does have its upsides, but there's a lot we have to wade through and it feels like more and more every year. And it feels like it's becoming harder. I'm sorry, did I jump in on you, Mia? Were you going to say something there?
No, it's fine.
I wasn't going to say anything.
Oh, sorry.
Well,
important.
Then confusion there. Yeah.
There was something I was going to say that, like, you say Dramageddon. I've always kind of called the chicken licking, like the sky is going to fall in. And I really think, they talked about COVID being contagious. I always felt that in the last 10 years, what we really need to worry about is anxiety is contagious. And people who are anxious tend to sell their anxiety to everybody else, because either I'm a fool for being anxious or you're a fool for not being anxious. So they're invested in selling their anxiety to other people, because otherwise they're overwrought and hysterical. And so I really saw it during the COVID years, the kind of, I was being made to feel like a fool for not, washing my groceries in the bath outside and things like that, And it's very unnerving not to be anxious when everybody around you is anxious, because it does make you feel, am I a thick here? Is
there something I don't know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what am I missing? Which is exactly what you're saying, Gurwinder, about, like, we are evolved to think and to look for patterns and to kind of think, well, what I must be missing if everybody else is thinking it. And then I kind of think that I've noticed this, in my own world, when I first got into, let's say, trans issues. And I live in Ireland, so I felt like an outlier because I didn't know anybody in Ireland who was really involved in trans issues, not in real life, the way I was. So I knew everybody in England, some in Australia, loads in America and Canada. So I kind of got this biased, inappropriate perception that the whole world out there had gone mad. Ireland was still sane. And was actually fine, because I went down to the shop and I met my friends and I'd go for a drink and everybody was completely normal. But clearly the rest of the world outside my little island had absolutely completely lost it, the English-speaking world. And then I started every so often leaving Ireland. Because you see, I kind of mostly got into it. Yeah, anyway, I started leaving Ireland and realising, actually, just like you said, Gurwinder, you go for a meal, nobody's talking about trans, nobody's hitting me over the head about what toilet I'm in and things like this. And I realised I'd created a complete delusion that Ireland was fine and the rest of the place. And I realised I was actually in the company online of an awful lot of very anxious people. And that was a shock to me, because then I realised I had to penetrate, and I realised all these WhatsApp groups, and I started realising this is the anxiety channel I'm on. I'm on a channel with extremely anxious people. And they're all selling their anxiety. I used to always say it about the school gate. These mothers would be there clucking at each other and getting into a state about the school trip or about this or about that. And I used to think, oh, Jesus, there's just anxiety over there. I think I'll give it a miss. And I realised I'd fallen in to a mass level of anxiety. And I think it should be noted that, yes, terrible things are happening. And yes, we are actually safer today than we've ever been before. And we are more educated today than we've ever been before. And we have opportunities to go places more than we ever have before. I think it's very healthy to remind ourselves of that, because it's very easy to fall into chicken licking kind of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a bit of a jolt for me when I find myself in normal society. I go out and I'm with normal people talking about normal things. It throws me off a little bit for a while. I feel out of place somehow, because I'm just so entrenched in gender all the time.
I think, it's important to be passionate. And I think one of the sort of struggles of being in this space is that you've got to balance being passionate with sort of having and maintaining perspective. This is a very difficult thing to do, but I think you do it pretty well, Mia, and I'm sure you do it as well, Stella. You seem pretty chilled out, but also obviously you're passionate enough to do these things. So I think one of the problems, and one thing that I've noticed especially lately with some of my sort of formerly anti-woke allies on Twitter, is how much they've just gone into the other direction. Because I was, because I've been sort of on Twitter sort of complaining about wokeness since like 2017, and there was a sort of bunch of us sort of mainly formed around Quillette, the magazine Quillette, and we basically used to just talk about, just insult wokeism, pretty much all day long. And there was what happened was that there was a small minority of us first, but then what happened is over time, I noticed, and this happened really badly during the pandemic, where a lot of people went from simply being anti-woke to just going full MAGA, and just kind of just completely in the other direction and just kind of becoming the same kind of irrational tribalist, but for the other team. And I think it's because they had that passion. They kept the passion, but they didn't maintain the perspective. And so, again, this was during the pandemic where everybody was spending more time online than usual. And so people were indoctrinated very easily. And it kind of became counterproductive because now the woke would come back and say, oh, look, these people that were criticizing us before, look, they support Trump now, So we were right about them. They're just right wingers. They're just far right. And so it sort of is a kind of own goal in a sense. And so it's very important, I think, to be passionate, but to maintain the perspective and to sort of remember what you're doing it for. It's why, I kind of get called a conservative, even though I don't really consider myself a conservative. I'm trying to conserve liberalism, So in that sense, I'm probably a conservative, right?
So
but I consider myself, more of a classical liberal. But because I have spoken out against wokeism, I'm automatically lumped in with conservatives, with the sort of, even sometimes with the far right. But this is in spite of the fact that I try to maintain perspective. I try not to go overboard in my criticism. I try to balance them in reason. And I think it's why looking at things from, for example, an evolutionary perspective is quite useful, because then you're kind of like, you're not being overly political. You're just saying, well, look, this is the science. This is the science that we understand so far. And it helps to sort of orient your arguments, in a certain direction. So I think it works for me. I mean, I don't know if that will work for everybody, but I find that this kind of has helped quite a bit. And I think it's especially important now that we're seeing something of a kind of backlash against wokeism now, especially online. I think, that there's been sort of like puberty blockers have been banned, I think, in a lot of countries, European countries. And, there's also been, sort of this whole trans sports thing is sort of gone in a favorable direction. Now, a lot of sports organizations are now forbidding biological males from competing in female sports. So there's been good progress, in that regard. But there's also this risk that we're sort of going a little bit into the other direction, where if you look at what Elon and Trump are doing, where they're just kind of gutting the US government of like any kind of, not just DEI, but like aid to help people in Africa from dying of AIDS and things like that. So, it's one of the things I'm fearing at the moment is an overcorrection, which I think is a result a lot of really Elon, because I think Elon is probably the most powerful man on the planet right now. Maybe, it's probably a toss-up between him and Trump. But because he has this platform and he's completely been just red-pilled, to the max, by a lot of the stuff that was coming out of Quillette, and also probably, the gender stuff, because obviously he has a daughter, or a son, who is sort of, trans or trans-identified. And so it's obviously personal for him, but he's also, into the whole the race stuff as well, because he's from South Africa, and recently there's this whole thing about Julius Malema, talking about killing the boa, and he signal boosted that, and then there was the grooming gangs thing recently. So he's going full whack on this, and I agree with Elon on a lot of things, but I think the way that he's doing things is he's not really thinking before he's posting a lot of stuff, and it's leading to this kind of slightly irrational overcorrection in certain respects. So I think it's quite important to not sort of go with the tide. I'm trying not to go with the tide here. I'm trying to maintain a sort of straight path while the wind is shifting in the other direction. All these corporations are sort of abandoning DEI programs now, and the whole sort of vibe is shifting into the direction. But it's very easy because, again, we're tribal. We're not, we didn't evolve to be woke. We evolved to be tribal. And so that wokeism can easily be replaced by another form of tribalism, very easily.
I've long feared the overcorrection. I don't know what the overcorrection looks like on the gender issue, because whenever I think about the fact that I fear an overcorrection, I try and imagine what's the limit, what I think would be too much. And then I realize that I'm quite extreme in my views. I had this conversation last night.
I can imagine the overcorrection.
Yeah, I think gender essentialism will probably be the overcorrection.
Yeah. I think, is this what you tell me, and then I'll say.
Yeah, just this idea that
women have to be feminine, and that no men are going to be able to work in a makeup counter, and girls should be doing this, that, and the other, and boys this, and no messing around, no tomboys, none of that. Do you follow me? And like already, I've kind of had quite distinct conversations with women who are saying, no, I don't want any feminine boys. I don't want any boys running around. Little 4-year-olds, I don't want them running around looking pretty. No way. They can be boys. Is that what you mean, Gurwinder?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because we've seen a resurgence of like the trad sort of worldview, where
totally,
if you have these trad wives basically, just basically locked in the kitchen all day and trying to do this homesteading stuff, and it's quite kind of strange. It's catching on like amongst quite a large proportion of the right, especially. But I think wokeism is still more of a problem. Yeah.
Okay, like I've often been accused of being a trad wife because I chose to be a stay-at-home mum for a decade. I chose to stay home with my children, and that makes me a trad wife, apparently. I think the trad thing is an overcorrection to feminism and women going out into the workforce and not valuing motherhood at all. For gender, what I was meaning was like on the medical side, an overcorrection. Whenever I think about that, I realize that I am on the extreme, and that I think the whole thing needs to be, well, not banned, but just condemned to history with lobotomies. And so I don't know that there is an overcorrection on the medical side for me. I think it's just all wrong.
That's specific
I agree.
to the medical side.
That,
What
that's
about
medical, not
makeup,
cultural.
Clothes, hair. It'll be all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I don't. I would once have thought, Eddie Izzard with his makeup and his clothes and everything. Oh, that's great. That's amazing. He's experimenting. And now a man in a dress with lipstick, it's just like, it's horrifying to me. I'm so.
And what about the in a woman?
Masculine women, not at all, because women are not a threat. It's the man in the dress. I instantly register him as a threat. He is someone who's going to make me call him a woman. He's someone who's going to force me to undress in front of him, and he's somebody who is going to steal all my rights. And that's like an instinctive reaction now when I see a man in a dress. Whereas women, masculine women, they're no threat to me. Go for it. But audience capture, can we go there? I want to go to audience capture because you have a huge audience and you've never been captured by it. and I think, well, I don't think so. Do you think you've been captured by your audience? So first of all, explain what it is, and then have you been captured?
Dad.
I think probably to a certain extent. I think it's probably impossible for somebody to not be influenced by their audience, unless they just are completely writing in, oblivious to their audience. I don't think I've been captured, but I've been influenced. I think it's probably the better way to put it. I've been influenced by.
Okay.
I don't think it's so much. I think I'm probably being too modest, but like I don't think I've actually like changed my beliefs or anything like that because of my audience. I don't think I've compromised my integrity, because my integrity is very important to me. But I think that I've probably been influenced by what I think the kinds of subjects that my audience would probably be interested in, for instance. So that, there's this very fine line between audience influence and audience capture. Audience influence, I think, is normal, and I think it's a good thing. I think you should care about what your audience wants to an extent, because you're writing for them at the end of the day. They're paying you, or they're at least sharing your work. So I write for my audience, but I'm very careful to not compromise my own integrity, my own values. I'm not going to say something that I think is false just to please my audience. That's a very important thing for me. I think a lot of people do that, unfortunately. because it's profitable to say certain things. And again, I think one of the reasons why there's been an overcorrection on places like Twitter is because of audience capture. And I would look at people like, for instance, James Lindsay. He was originally somebody I really liked. I thought he was a really smart, very sensible person. But I think over time, he kind of developed this audience of hardcore conservatives. He was originally sort of like an atheist, a new atheist guy, right? So he was in the same group as like Richard Dawkins, obviously not on the same stature, but he was in that kind of that group. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, kind of. He was one of those kinds of guys. And he was more interested in rationality and things like that. This was back in 2017. What happened was that he sort of, after the sort of the SoCal Squared affair and all that, his name blew up.
Oh, yeah.
And I noticed there was a big difference between, say, him and, say, Helen Pluckrose. Helen Pluckrose remained very, very, I admire Helen a lot because she remained on the straight path. She didn't veer too much. Yeah. She was just continuing to be who she was always, even after she developed an audience. James Lindsay went the kind of other way. He developed a big conservative audience, and he started to sort of play to his audience. So he started criticizing not just wokeism, but just leftism, and then just liberalism generally, and he was criticizing pretty much everything. And then he started supporting Trump, and then he was just full MAGA, and he was full red pill, and he was just all the normal red pill Trump talking points. And I think he's actually he's realized, and he started to sort of reorient himself a little bit recently over the past couple of years. But he was a good example, I think, of somebody who I think was audience captured, because he got a lot of clout by echoing these standard traditional conservative talking points. He's just one example.
I just interrupt though in defense, because James is a friend of mine.
Okay.
I don't know that he was so much captured by his audience, especially given what he's been going through recently. So he did the papers, the spoof papers with Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian. He got really famous. I think he's always genuinely meant what he says, and it comes from a well-researched place. But recently he's spoken out against the pendulum swing and the extremism on what he calls the woke right. I don't know enough about it.
Yeah, I was going to come on to this. Yeah.
Right. So I don't know that he's technically audience captured, but that's because he's a friend, so I have to defend him.
I mean, I think I probably would disagree with you on whether he was audience captured.
Can we explain what audience capture is first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Can we go there?
Yeah. So audience capture is basically when you start doing what your audience wants, and you essentially you develop a brand based on what you're famous for, right? So you might go viral for a certain thing, and if then what happens is that you see that that's kind of got you famous. You've got a new audience of like certain people of a certain disposition, and then what you do is that you double down on that brand, and you find that the feedback you're getting from your audience is great. You're getting loads of followers. You're suddenly going viral all the time, and you become intoxicated by the virality and the fame. And what happens is that your content starts to shift towards becoming this brand. Like, you try to embody this brand, and the more that you do it, the more you eventually become a caricature of yourself, because you're kind of, the things that got you famous become the thing that you're building your career on. And the reason why I think that this... Sorry.
Can you use, because in your amazing article, well, from what year, 2022 maybe, that you wrote about this, you used Nikocado Avocado as an example. Can you go through his, because he's had an interesting development in his story.
Yeah. So this is interesting because, so Nikocado was originally, he was a vegan, and I think he played music and he sang sort of, and he found that he wasn't really getting much of an audience, but then he started doing mukbang videos, and mukbang is this Korean sort of phenomenon where people begin to eat online. It's literally they just get this big bowl of food and they just start eating. If you put this video on, it's like you're sharing a meal with somebody, basically. That's what it looks like. And so it's like some people use it, for a kind of ambiance. and he started, getting a little bit of an audience. And then what happened is that he started scoffing his face and eating as much as he could to see how much he could eat. And he did this because of, some people in his comments asked him to. They said it would be great if you could, could you finish this whole meal by yourself? And so he started doing that. And he started getting a lot more followers when he did this. So he started doubling down on this competitive eating, and he started eating as much as he could and started trying to outdo himself each time. And each time he did it, he got more and more people following him, more and more people egging him on. And eventually he put on like a huge amount of weight, and he just ballooned in size, and he became very unhealthy. And so he essentially became a caricature of himself in that respect. But what's very interesting is that he recently reversed this. And I was going to say that I think this happened with James Lindsay. So I do think that James Lindsay did get audience capture. I think this is a common thing. I don't think this, this speaks to him being a bad person or a bad character. I think it's a natural thing. Like I said, I'm influenced by my audience also. I think he was influenced by his audience to a pretty strong extent, I think, around the pandemic time, because I noticed a change in tone in his tweets. And this was common. This wasn't just him. This was a lot of people that this happened to. Chris Rufo's another example. He's gone way, way the other side. But I think James Lindsay has realized this recently. And I think it's why he's spoken out against the woke right. I think Konstantin Kisin has also sort of gone against the woke right. I don't know if he did it as much, if he was audience captured of it. He probably wasn't. But I think there's been a lot of people have sort of come to terms with the fact that, yes, they were sort of almost going to become fully trapped by this kind of red pill thing. And there's been this kind of, they've tried to sort of get themselves out of it by criticizing the other side. So James Lindsay is now talking about the woke right, and I think he's moving back towards where he was before in sort of 2017. And I think maybe some other people I've noticed have recently seen the way that X has just gone fully right wing. X is now pretty much a right wing platform. It used to be a left wing platform, before Elon took over, but now it's just a full right wing platform. Every time I go on, I only follow about 380 people or something. And so I don't have this crazy feed or anything, but even then, all I'm seeing is just right wing propaganda all the time. So I think a lot of people have seen this now, and they've realized that, okay, so now it's time to go against this grain. I think people like me and people like James Lindsay and a lot of the other people who originally spoke out against wokeness, we did it because we were going against the grain, because the norm was wokeism. That was the norm. If you go on Twitter in 2017, it was woke. It was just completely woke. It was you couldn't say that men are women. Men are not women. You couldn't say that men can't get pregnant. If you did, you'd get your account terminated. So it was fully woke in 2017. And that's when we were criticizing it a lot, But then now it's gone the other way. I think Elon was banning people for saying the word cis, and a lot of I know that a lot of left-wing accounts have had their accounts stifled. And so now it becomes more important, I think, on Twitter at least, to speak out against this. So I think a lot of people are starting to reorient themselves back to where they originally were because of that, we're kind of like chameleons, but instead of adapting to our environment, we clash with our environment.
Yeah. I like the way you go into it, because, it's hard to talk about somebody and make sure that you tread that fine line. And I do think, for example, James Lindsay, I like him. I think he's integrity and he's honourable and brave. I think it's very easy if you're clever, as he is, and then if there's an audience. I think the headiness, I think the madness of the online world, and hundreds of people saying this to you and hundreds of people saying that, and then it goes into thousands. And I actually think it's kind of that way madness lies. I really think it's a very mad environment, being online. I was very interested when you said I only follow 380 people. I thought, oh my God, I follow thousands. What the hell am I doing? I never thought, why am I doing that to myself? It's giving myself pins in my head. I'm going to do a call. But there was something you said earlier that I wanted to lean into. And I do think, like Mia said, that, James is pushing against, when it's neither profitable nor popular, he's pushing against the woke right. And that's a difficult position, and he's doing it. He calls it the woke right. I think it's an interesting phrase. But you said something that I'd like us to just give a little bit of time to, which you said, I also see myself as a classical liberal. And I know Andrew Doyle does too. And many people who are now being called right-wing are saying, but I'm a classical liberal. And you said something interesting, because you said, I'd like to conserve classical liberalism, if you follow me. That's the only conservative part of me, is trying to conserve the values of classical liberalism. What do you think is going on with this crazy left-right, divide that's happening? Because it's such concept creep that has happened with the words left and right. It's lost all meaning and all sanity, and it's just been. It's a word to weaponize, and that's all it is. Where do you think we are? We need new words, and you're the man to give them to us.
Yeah, so I am probably conservative in some ways. I'm not completely just a liberal. I'm conservative in some things. I'm a liberal in other things. I'm right on some things, left on some things. I think the left-right spectrum is obsolete, to be honest. The left-right spectrum really comes from the French Revolution. You had people sitting on the right of the king, the left of the king, and it was basically this idea that it worked for France at that time, because that was what the social system. The social system was about class. It was about you had aristocrats and you had the sort of the people at the bottom, the proletarians or whatever. And there was this kind of conflict between them, and that was what essentially was the left-right divide was about. It was about reform. It was about radicalism versus reaction, and so that it worked for that time, and it kind of worked in the 20th century, because in the 20th century you had these two great forces. You had Marxism, or rather, you had communism and capitalism against each other. So the great economic struggle of the 20th century very much fit into the left-right paradigm. But I think in the 21st century, I think capitalism has won, mostly. I think there aren't really any sort of major communist countries on the planet. I mean, China's not communist anymore. It's a state capitalist country. The only communist countries that exist now are all like really small tin pot dictatorships, Venezuela and North Korea. And, so I think because capitalism has won, and it hasn't won unanimously, it hasn't won completely. I mean, socialism has been integrated into capitalism. So now all capitalist countries have sort of social safety nets, for example, welfare systems.
Yeah.
So they've integrated. So there's been a kind of unity. And so there is no such thing as a kind of war between these two forces anymore, on a global scale, at least. And so now the new battle, you could frame it in various ways, but I think one of the ways is quite controversial, but it's probably that there's a conflict between sort of blank slatism and hereditarianism. So it's basically belief in biological determinism to a certain extent with blank slatism. I think that's probably the new dichotomy, because that really, if you look at the kind of battles that are going on now, it's really over things like gender, it's things like race. And all of this is really about whether you believe in that people are born as blank slates, or whether they have certain inbuilt structures in their brains, some schema in their brains, which are pre-existing, So it's actually become more of a scientific rather than economic kind of debate. So that's one way you could frame it. That's not the only way you could frame it. But I think that explains a lot of the culture wars going on now. But it's also, the way I like to frame it is actually in terms of people who are willing to work with people they disagree with and people who are not. I think that the moderates on both the left and on the right have more in common with each other than they do with the extremes on their own side. And, this horseshoe theory is a thing, isn't it? So the horseshoe theory is basically this idea that the extreme left are essentially the same as the extreme right. They just swap, the identities of the who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed. They both hate Jews, for example. They both believe that there's a conspiracy to keep the common people down. They both believe that they cannot coexist with other people of other persuasions. So I think that it's probably more sort of helpful to look at the world in terms of that, in terms of people who are willing to work with people that disagree with people like moderates, basically moderates versus extremists. I think that's going to probably be the more important thing at the moment. In terms of left and right, I think the reason why people still stick to these left and right categories is because people are tribalists. We lived as tribe. We lived in tribes for so long that we're just accustomed to being part of this thing. This tribe, and it's very hard to shake people out of that. The left has an identity now, and the right has an identity. It has its, the left has its own color. It has the color red, for example. It has its anthems. In the UK, for instance, keep the red flag flying, whatever. It has its own texts, the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, and all this sort of stuff. And so they have their own culture. The left have their own culture. The right have their own culture as well. They have different cultures. You have a more libertarian culture. You have neo-reactionary culture of Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land and stuff, and then you have like more trad culture. You have the Christian right culture. So these groups have their own culture, and once a culture has been established, it becomes an easy home for people, because it has its things it has the mantras that you can repeat, so it's very easy to belong to this group. If we were going to create new ones, like the ones that I was saying before, you would need to create a new culture for these tribes. But I would actually not want that to happen, because I think it's just not good for people to see themselves in terms of these group identities. I think once you do that, then it leads to problems, because you cease to think for yourself, and you start to think according to what the group wants you to think. And either you take your beliefs from your group, or you take your group from your beliefs. So either way it leads to blindness. And so I think this is a big problem for people to be part of this tribe. I think people should seek to leave their tribe and try to not have what I call package deal ethics. So package deal ethics is this idea that if you agree with one group on, say, abortion rights, therefore you must agree with them on everything else. You must agree with them on gun rights. You must agree with them on the economy. You must agree with them on climate change. You must agree with them on race, gender, whatever. Right. So what happens is that if you look at people now, you can normally predict what they're going to believe just from one of their beliefs.
I know.
So if you know their belief on one thing, you know their belief on everything else. And this is a sign that people are essentially taking package deal ethics. They're taking it as a package deal, buy one, get one free kind of thing. So I think what I would like to see people do is to start being a little bit more sort of pick and choose, find the things that they like from each ideology and synthesize them. That's what I do. And I think that's what the smartest people that I know, and the people are not just necessarily the smartest people, but the people that are the least captured by whatever, captured by a group, by their audience, by institutions. They tend to be the people who are the most resistant to indoctrination.
We're coming up towards the end, but I'm dying to ask, I'm sure Mia has a question as well, but before we go, I'm dying to ask you about neo-toddlerism, because I think an awful lot of parents who will listen will be very interested in this. You coined the term and the concept. I'd love if you could tell us about it, because I think you hit the nail on the head with it.
Yeah, so neo-toddlerism is essentially the belief that you can create utopia by acting like a 3-year-old. That's the short and easy of it. But basically, it's a kind of new form of activism that I've noticed has become very prominent in the West, especially over the past couple of years, where instead of like trying to forge good arguments and trying to, convince people with rhetoric or, trying to create good protest movements, in which you have a leadership and you actually go out there and try and change people's minds. What people are doing instead is they're doing stunts. They're basically trying to create as much outrage as they can by, for example, throwing orange paint over a painting, or releasing cockroaches into a building, or just doing things that are going to shock and outrage people in order to go viral online, so that you can then convince people of your cause. And you've seen it. I think we see it a lot with, especially with the sort of pro-Palestinian movement. I see a lot of people, especially over this last summer in 2024, a lot of people doing that. You see it also with the trans rights activists doing this. You see it with a lot of, it tends to be a bit more common on the left, I think, because I think with the left, they tend to be younger. Like leftist activists tend to be a little bit younger. And so they are more in tune with sort of TikTok and things like that. And TikTok's where these things go viral. So you saw this thing, for example, where people were ripping down posters of hostages, of Israeli hostages. That was one example. Another example was that a statue of Anne Frank had her hands painted red, which I thought was really, really crass. But and then there's,
really
all this other stuff of people chaining themselves to doors of buildings. Greta Thunberg did this for climate change. Climate activism is another one, which is very, very popular with this kind of stuff. You have people throwing soup over paintings and all that kind of stuff. It's basically just to shock. It's to create a meme that's going to go viral on TikTok, in a 10-second clip, basically. That's the new form of activism. So the reason why I believe it's like toddlerism, or being like a toddler, is a toddler will usually make a scene when they want attention. So they'll scream at the loud of their voice, they'll stamp their feet down, they'll hit something, they'll throw their toys or whatever. They'll do it to create a scene, to create a racket, to create, attention, basically, in order to get what they want. And I see this as analogous to what we're seeing with these activists, where they don't really have any arguments. They're not really presenting any sort of anything new. They're not saying anything new. They're not making good points. They're just lashing out, basically. They're lashing out at society in order to get attention. And I've seen it's become very popular on social media, because social media thrives on outrage. The whole sort of infrastructure of social media is built around outrage. There's a word for it, rage bait. Rage bait is where people try to make people angry in order to go viral. And this is essentially a form of rage bait that is not content, but is actual physical activity. Because rage bait was previously articles or videos that, of people saying things that would make people angry. Now it's people just not even saying things, but just smashing a statue, or, throwing paint over something, So it's literally just an act. There's no intellectual substance behind it. It's purely for shock factor. And I feel like this is bad because it's counterproductive. It doesn't actually help people. It doesn't help a cause. One of the things that was happening in the UK quite a bit was people were standing in the middle of the road, sitting in the middle of the road, blocking traffic. This was, climate change. And this it didn't achieve anything except make people hate this group. The group, I think, was called Extinction Rebellion was one of them. And then there were a few others as well. Basically, and these groups there were surveys that were done in the aftermath of these actions, and the public overwhelmingly rejected it. They overwhelmingly hated this group, and they didn't want to even listen to them after that. So they're counterproductive, right? They don't even work for the people that are trying to make them, work for them. But it also is bad because if you're blocking the roads, people who were trying to go to the hospital because they had, there was women in labor who needed to go to the hospital. They couldn't go to the hospital. There were people with injuries or illnesses, people with cancer appointments that couldn't make it to the hospital because these kids were just sitting in the middle of the road. And so it's not good for anybody. And I think, it's a bad thing because not only because it's bad in the real world, but also because it creates this incentive structure. When these people go viral, when they go famous, when they become famous, it convinces other people to do it also. It convinces people, if you want to change the world, if you want to have your way, if you want to be famous, just smash a statue, and this is not a good message to be sending to kids. And so I think, this is why I sort of felt the need to speak out about it, because I think it's bad by every metric. There's nothing good about it. It's bad for everybody involved, including the activists themselves. So, yeah.
Right. But my last question, Stella, can I ask one that might be a long answer? How much longer do we have?
Well, as long I feel for you, because I feel like we've drilled you, Gurwinder. But yeah,
Oh,
for it.
Yeah, it's a
One
pleasure.
last
I don't know.
question for them.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
it's my last. I actually have two things or more. I could talk to you
go
for
on,
hours. But the one thing that I want to talk to you about most is the point of the interview. Last time when I interviewed you, it was because you had written that piece that was published in Unheard about the left, people on the left, and the overrepresentation of mental illnesses and what you call a pathologization pandemic. And that was the subject of our podcast last time. But can we go there? Because that really ties in with, obviously, it really ties in with trends. And I think that might be a good place to end this. So what's going on? Why is the left making people sick?
So there was a guy called Ivan Illich, who's a priest, and he was writing around sort of 1970s. And he coined this term called medicalization. And basically it's this idea that increasingly normal things, normal behaviors are being recategorized as abnormal, as medical issues. So for example, something would be something like shyness, for example. So shyness was originally just, it's just a personality that you have, you're shy. But then this eventually became medicalized as generalized anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder.
Social anxiety.
Social anxiety disorder. And so it became something that had to be fixed and it medicated essentially. And this was back in the 70s. So it was probably an issue then. But I think in the digital age, this has become way, way worse because all the incentive structures for this to happen have lined up. So let's consider the different incentive structures. So when Ivan Illich was writing, the only real incentive structure, the main incentive structure was that the medical industry benefited by having more and more things classed as medical disorders, because then it had more things it could treat. It could basically have more power essentially, and more money, more funding, because it have to fix this new thing, whatever. And then say, I think Mia's covered this a lot. I mean, Edward Short has also written about sort of in the 1980s, and there was sort of this multiple personality disorder and dissociative identity disorder, which is, as it's now known, where people were beginning to sort of see themselves as sick because it became kind of like an identity. So we saw another sort of incentive structure emerge in the 1980s where it wasn't just the medical industry that were incentivized to do this, but individuals themselves, patients themselves, because they would read something, they would read about, for instance, they'd read about people having multiple personalities, and then they would think, oh, okay, that probably explains why I feel bad, about this or that. And then they would present to the hospital with these new sort of symptoms that they may or may not have had. I mean, they may have had them to the extent that they may have believed that they had them, which could have made them real to a certain extent. But this was a pretty underground problem in the 20th century. This was something that only a few people were interested in. But what happened is that in the digital age, it just became way worse, because now you have a social media which allows people to spread, as you said earlier, Stella, they can spread their anxiety, online. They can spread them across these networks. And what this has done is it's created what I would call a pathologization pandemic, where you now have people not only who can convince themselves that they're sick, but they can convince other people that they're sick as well. And they can do this through social media. If you have a look at, for instance, many of the communities that you see on TikTok or Reddit or Tumblr, you see that there's actually communities that form around people having a certain disorder. And some of these disorders are really bizarre, for example, you have like a, BIID, which is a really obscure disorder where people believe that they should have one of their limbs cut off or something because they believe they should never have had that limb in the first place. Or people believe that they should blind themselves because they weren't supposed to be able to see. And people form communities around these really obscure sort of conditions because, again, there are many incentives why people might want to do this. One of them is that they might want a sense of belonging in an alienated world. Another is that it sort of can be like a kind of Munchausen's syndrome where it can be a form of sympathy gain, sort of sympathy collection, where people will, and this has been shown on Twitter, for instance, and on TikTok, where people will engage in something called sad fishing, where they will, pretend to be part of this. They'll pretend to have this condition, for instance, tics, TikTok tics, Tourette's tics. They'll say, "I've got Tourette's."
Oh, yeah.
There was this one influencer called Tix and Roses, who became quite prominent on TikTok because she claimed to have Tourette's syndrome, and she would essentially, just have these outbursts on TikTok, these sort of tics, and she would sort of make out like it was really, really hurting her life, and how she was trying to manage without trying to swear at people and all this sort of stuff. And obviously she'd collect donations, and she would get clout for it. It turned out she was completely making it all up. She didn't have it at all, because a video emerged of her earlier in her life. I think her mother actually might have posted it, in which basically she had she was completely tick free. And another guy.
Can I just ask, did she start a contagion? Because there are TikTok ticks.
Yes.
Was she responsible for a contagion of TikTok ticks as well?
Well, I don't know if it was her specifically, but there was this contagion that did emerge, and it was actually known as TikTok ticks. And
definitely.
It was because what happened is that, people would sort of see these people with these conditions. And the two most prominent sort of ones on TikTok were Tourette's and dissociative identity disorder. These were the two most prominent ones. And I think this is because these have a spectacular element to them.
And trans.
Of course, yeah.
Think.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah,
Not
and that as well,
developable.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's probably the most prominent one. I mean, and I think the reason for these is because they're very visually sort of spectacular to a certain extent, especially if you look at Tourette's is sort of, somebody having this outburst. Dissociative identity disorder, somebody just becoming somebody else. And then the trans thing, somebody dressed as somebody of the opposite sex. These are visual things. They're very visual.
And the mastectomy scars and
and the scars.
Wow.
And these are things, so these have led to other people sort of just being infected with these imaginary sort of diseases that these people are claiming to have. It's been something that has been very prominent on pretty much every social media website, but especially on TikTok. And I think it's because the short form of it allows people to just quickly, show their condition, and then, the algorithm does the rest. Because if you're interested in it, you basically watch it, and then you'll get introduced to more of that content. The TikTok algorithm is a very, very it's a complete menace. Because if you like one thing, just even if you show even my interest in one thing, it will just repeatedly show you again and again more of that thing. And so because of this very virulent algorithm on TikTok, it's become the premier place for this kind of contagion to take place. But again, this is just one of the incentives, right? There's also incentives by people on the left, and particularly woke people, to believe that these disorders are more prevalent than they actually are. Because, for example, if gender dysphoria is more prominent than it actually is, then this makes the whole thing about trans rights more of an issue. It means that it's more important. And so it makes people want to go out there and, do more about it. So it's like, one of the things that's very interesting, I think, about the trans thing is that some people are not, some people, I think, this is how I see it, right? I see that their gender dysphoria is real in the sense that people really do feel a discomfort and a mismatch between themselves and what they call their gender identity. I don't think that so-called normal or cisgendered people have a gender identity, but I believe that the problem with people who have gender dysphoria is that they do have a gender identity. I think that's their problem, that they have a gender identity.
Or they believe they have one.
Yeah, well, I mean, their identity is something that they believe. So yeah, it's a belief. But I think that that's their problem. And I think some people, I think maybe are gender dysphoric because they have something actually wrong with their brains. But I think those people are a tiny, tiny minority of people. They're probably people I would say are analogous to the people with BIID, right? They're a very, very minority of people.
Paraphilic, but largely paraphilic, I would
Yeah,
say.
I was going to say that. I was going to say, and then there's another group of people that are autogynephiliacs, and then there's another group of people who are not medically or psychologically trans in any kind of way, and they're simply calling themselves trans in solidarity with other trans people, and so they're doing it for political reasons. And these are generally the people that call themselves non-binary. They tend to do this. They tend to pretend that they're trans because they are doing it. You know, they want to normalize being trans, right? So there are people have different incentives for identifying as the opposite sex. And sorry, you want to say something?
Yeah, I recall something though about your article, the specifically for the left. Sorry, you've got the victimhood culture, and then there was this really interesting concept of the locus of control, which has a left-right divide. Am I right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I just finished what I was just saying before. So and then I'll get on to that.
Okay.
So the reason why I think so this is another incentive for the left is that they basically want to normalize being trans, right? They want to normalize it, and so it's in their interests if more people are trans, right?
Yeah.
So this is why they try to. This is why if somebody's trans, they're like, believe this person, don't doubt them, believe them, because the more people that you believe are trans, the more of a thing trans becomes, the more normalized it is. And that, you know, then so that's another incentive. And then there is the locus of control, and this is another incentive. So all of these incentives, you know, they all sort of intersect. This is probably the most important one. Locus of control is basically so if you have an internal locus of control, you believe that you are in charge of your well-being. You believe you are in charge of your destiny. You believe that your actions determine your fate. Whereas if you have an external locus of control, you believe that you are essentially at the mercy of your circumstances, and your destiny is determined by things you can't control. And one of the key differences between people who identify as liberal and people who identify as conservative is that the people who identify as liberal tend to have more of an external locus of control, and the people who are conservative tend to have more of an internal locus of control. And this makes sense when you actually look at what they believe. So, for example, liberals or leftists, as some people might call them, they tend to believe that the reason why some people are really poor and in poverty in say the Western, Western civilization is because capitalism is evil, because of the patriarchy, because of systemic racism, because of these structures that they can't do anything about that are holding them down. Whereas conservatives tend to believe that the reason why these people are poor is because they're not working hard enough. They're not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. They need to do more, basically. So this is a fundamental difference between these two worldviews, the locus of control. And the interesting thing about the pathologization pandemic is it's really a result of people having an external locus of control. It's a result of people wishing to blame their problems on something they can't do something about. And so it's, in this case, it's not systemic racism, it's not the patriarchy, it's not capitalism. In this case, it's a medical condition that they have, right? So the reason that you might be shy is because you have social anxiety disorder. The reason why, you feel a lack of self-esteem is because you have dysmorphia. The reason, so all of these personality flaws or disadvantages can be attributed to some medical condition with enough imagination, right? And it's easier to blame your problems on something you can't do something about than on yourself, right? And I think that one of the reasons why there has been an explosion of people blaming their issues on these medical disorders is because when you do that, you don't have to take responsibility for your own suffering and your own well-being. It's much easier to just resign yourself to saying, oh, well, the reason I'm poor is because of capitalism, or the reason I'm shy is because I have a disorder I can't do anything about. It doesn't matter if I go out there and try and meet people. I'm not going to be able to do it because I have this thing in my brain, and the reason why I'm, I have low energy is because I have long COVID or whatever. And this is not to say that some people don't have long COVID. Of course they do. But if you just blame yourself, if you blame your problems on other things, on something that you can't do something about, you don't have to worry about it anymore. Ironically enough, you can just carry on and just say, oh, I don't need to improve myself. I don't need to, pull myself up by my bootstraps. And so there's an incentive there as well, a self-serving interest for people to blame their issues on medical problems because, it just makes them not have to take responsibility.
Right. I've seen it with ADHD. I have this thing about ADHD at the moment because I self-diagnosed when I was reading the DSM because I forget to return my calls and I'm always losing my keys. But I've seen it with my daughter's friend. One of my daughter's friends got diagnosed with ADHD and, she was like 10 years old or something like that. And after the diagnosis, she became more scatterbrain and all over the place because she's like, oh, I have ADHD. Everything was, oh, I have ADHD. Rather than like trying to focus and like get things together, she used the ADHD diagnosis as a crutch. It's like, oh, I can't do that because I have ADHD. And there's a real problem there. If you take your you can take your diagnosis and you can use it to understand yourself and improve your life, or you can use it as a crutch and therefore you never have to take responsibility for your failings because you're diagnosed with ADHD or autism or whatever.
Exactly. And I actually have personal experience of this because when I was a kid, I had this really strange sort of a form of obsessive compulsive disorder where if one side of my body was touched by anything, I would immediately have to touch the other side of my body, the exact opposite side. So if I was walking and my left arm, say my left shoulder brushed against the door, I would immediately have to rub my right shoulder. And I would this happened for years. And it just caused me like a lot of discomfort. And over time it got worse. And the more conscious I became of it, the worse it got. Like the more conscious I was, the more I regarded myself as having OCD, the worse this problem got. And so like for ages, this was really like maddening thing that I had. And then I noticed one day that basically I had touched my arm against something and I hadn't noticed. And because I hadn't noticed, I hadn't felt the need to do it to the other side. And so what happened was that I realized then that, hang on a second, this is just purely in my mind. And it's just a focus. It's just what I'm focusing on. And so from then on, I just started to just deliberately not pay attention to proprioception, where my body is in relation to, to things. And so what happened is that eventually after a while, I just forgot about it. I just completely forgot about it. I didn't think about it anymore. And now, look, I can easily touch that side of my arm. And I don't have to touch the other side.
Can I ask, have you written about that?
I haven't, no.
You ever written?
Probably
that would be very interesting. Yeah, that'd be very interesting. And if you do, I'd love if you, just to give you more to do, if you considered studying up about OCD and symmetry, and how much of OCD is about symmetry, and also how much of religion is about symmetry. As in, if you follow me, it's very symmetric. And then if you look at deeply religious people, you can see a lot of OCD in it. If you follow me, and there's an awful lot. There's a lot of depth in that, and you start looking back in the centuries of the extreme religious people, and then suddenly we've got this outbreak of OCD in an post-religious age. It's a fascinating subject. We better close it up, so I could talk to you forever.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
But we really should close it up. But hopefully, maybe you'll come back another day because there's so much to speak about. Just on the ADHD as well, Mia. I am whatever. I'm certainly a lively personality. But, in the last couple of years, like I work as a psychotherapist, in the last couple of years, I've been diagnosed by so many people as ADHD. It's like, okay, so I'm 50. For the first 47 years, nobody ever mentioned ADHD. Everybody's diagnosing me with ADHD, which speaks to everything you've been saying. Gurwinder, about mental gymnastics, tribalism. It brings it all together, basically. But thank you so much. You're awesome.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Welcome
I'd love to do it again.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just Gurwinder.blog is where you can find me.
And on Twitter, you're great on Twitter as well.
I'm all right.
And you got to write a book.
Yeah, I'm working on one. Yeah, I'm working on one at the moment. Just taking a lot longer than I expected, but yeah, it should be done hopefully this year.
Great.
So cool. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Thank
Love
you.
to. Thank you.